147 people were forced onto a homemade wooden raft and left in the open Atlantic. 13 days later, only 15 were still alive. They survived thirst, mutiny, murder, and acts that would later horrify Europe. But the most disturbing part of the story was discovered somewhere else. The ship everyone had been desperate to escape was still there. The story begins in the summer of 1816, when France was trying to put pieces of its overseas empire back in place after the fall of Napoleon. Britain was returning the colony of St. Louis in Senegal to French control, and France needed to deliver a new governor, officials, soldiers, supplies, and their families. This was not supposed to be an expedition into the unknown. It was an administrative transfer, the 19th century version of moving an office, except the office had to cross the Atlantic under sail. 4 ships left Rochefort on the French Atlantic coast. The largest and fastest was the Medusa, a 40-gun frigate with a wooden hull almost 160 feet long, 3 masts, and rigging that had recently been repaired. It was a serious military vessel, not some leaking merchant boat being held together by rope and prayer. Around 400 people crowded aboard, including sailors, troops, government officials, civilians, and the new colonial administration. The Medusa also had something every large ship needs more than fresh paint or good sails. It needed a captain who understood the sea. It got Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix. Chaumareix was a French aristocrat, a royalist, and, by most descriptions, a courteous man. He also had not seriously commanded at sea for roughly 20 years. After the Bourbon monarchy returned to power, loyal royalists were restored to positions from which the Revolution and Napoleon had pushed them aside. In political terms, his appointment made sense. The king had returned, his people were returning, and jobs had to be distributed. The Atlantic Ocean was not consulted. There were experienced officers aboard the Medusa. Some had served during the Napoleonic era and had the kind of practical experience that comes from spending years watching coastlines, winds, currents, and depths. Chaumareix did not appear eager to rely on them. Old political loyalty is mixed with professional pride, which is dangerous on land and much more expensive at sea. A passenger named Rochefort also gained influence over navigation. Later accounts describe him as a philosopher and a member of a philanthropic society connected with Cape Verde. That sounds impressive at dinner. It does not automatically qualify a man to guide a 40-gun frigate through dangerous coastal waters. Whatever his social credentials, he did not have the standing of the experienced naval officers already aboard. Then the new governor, Julien Désert Schmaltz, added another ingredient. He wanted to reach Senegal quickly. Again, this is easy to understand. A new governor does not dream of arriving behind everyone else. The Medusa was the fastest ship in the group, so after passing Madeira, it began pulling away from the other vessels. Soon the convoy was no longer a convoy in any practical sense. The Medusa was out in front, taking a shorter route closer to the African coast. Shorter routes have one traditional problem. They are often shorter because they go near things sensible people prefer to avoid. Off the coast of what is now Mauritania lies the Bank of Arguin, a broad region of shifting sand and shallow water. It is not a dramatic reef rising like black teeth from the sea. Much of the danger stays hidden. Sand moves. Depth changes gradually. From the deck of a ship, the ocean can look perfectly normal until the water beneath the keel begins disappearing. The warnings came one after another. The color of the water changed. Suspended sand and sediment gave it a yellowish appearance. White breakers began showing up where deep water should have been calm. Rochefort saw a long gray shape on the horizon and identified it as Cape Blanco. If that really was Cape Blanco, the position of the ship made sense. It was not Cape Blanco. It was a bank of clouds. The first lieutenant, Antoine Maudet, became worried enough to check the depth himself. He used a lead line, one of the simplest navigation tools imaginable. A heavy piece of lead is tied to a marked rope and dropped overboard. When the weight hits bottom, the marks on the rope tell you how much water is beneath the ship. No computer, no satellite, no glowing screen. Just gravity and a piece of rope. The first sounding gave roughly 108 feet of water. Still enough. The problem was that the bottom was rising. When an experienced officer sees the water changing color, breakers appearing ahead, and the sea floor climbing toward the hull, the ocean is sending a message in very large letters. Modé went to the captain.
On July 2nd, 1816, the Medusa ran onto the bank of Arguin, about 30 miles from the coast. There was no cinematic explosion. The masts did not fall. The ship did not split in half. A large wooden frigate simply moved from water deep enough to carry it into water too shallow to carry it, and then stopped. That sounds almost harmless. It was not. The timing was especially bad because the Medusa grounded during a period of unusually high tide. The sun, earth, and moon were positioned so that the tide rose higher than usual. In practical terms, the sea had already given the stranded ship close to the best water level it was likely to get. Waiting for the next tide and hoping the ocean would lift the frigate free was not much of a plan. The obvious solution was to make the ship lighter. Cargo went overboard. Barrels went overboard. Food went overboard. Anything heavy that could be sacrificed might help the hull rise a little higher in the water. The Medusa also carried 40 heavy guns. Chaumaret refused to throw them away. The logic is not difficult to imagine. A naval officer does not casually dump the weapons of a warship into the Atlantic. Guns were expensive, important, and tied to the identity of the vessel. A 40-gun frigate without its guns is an embarrassing thing to bring home. The sandbank did not care about professional embarrassment. Attempts to free the Medusa failed. Waves struck the stranded hull. Wood creaked. Fear began moving through the passengers. People became convinced that the frigate might break apart. This is where it becomes important not to judge everyone with knowledge they did not have. Today we know what happened to the Medusa over the next several weeks. The people standing on its deck did not. To them, the ship was trapped in open water on a sandbank, taking wave after wave. If the hull broke during the night, hundreds of people could suddenly be in the sea. Evacuation began to look reasonable. Then someone counted the seats. There were roughly 400 people aboard. The boats could carry only about 250. Arithmetic has a nasty habit of becoming morally complicated when there are fewer seats than human beings. The solution was a raft. Carpenters began building one from the materials available aboard the Medusa. Masts, spars, beams, and heavy timber were lashed together. The finished platform was about 65 feet long and roughly 23 feet wide. Engineer and geographer Alexandre Corréard, who would later survive on it, left a drawing of the construction. On paper, it does not look ridiculous. It was large. It was made from serious ship timber. It floated. Then, 147 people climbed onto it. Early survivor accounts sometimes rounded the number to 150. Modern museum accounts generally give 147, including one woman. Either way, the difference does not change the basic problem. The raft was overloaded almost immediately. Anyone who has ever tried to put too many people on a cheap floating mattress at a lake understands the principle. One person lies on it and stays mostly dry. A second person climbs aboard, and the whole thing sinks lower. Now replace the inflatable mattress with a platform of heavy, wet timber. Replace the second person with more than 100 people. Replace the calm lake with the Atlantic. The raft did not sink completely. That was almost worse. It floated low enough that much of the deck was underwater. People near the edges stood waist deep or worse.
Even the central portion was wet. The structure could keep them from immediately drowning while still forcing them to spend hour after hour standing in seawater. The survivors would later make a remarkable point. Even after their numbers had fallen to only 15, there still was not enough reliable dry space for everyone to lie down comfortably. At the beginning, there were 147. They were not standing on a floating island. They were standing in the ocean on top of one. The supplies were miserable. There was a bag of biscuits, 2 barrels of fresh water, and several barrels of wine. The biscuits were soaked and essentially gone almost immediately. There was no useful rudder, no proper system of oars. The raft could not realistically navigate itself toward shore. The plan was for the lifeboats to tow it. Again, on paper, this sounds possible. Several boats move toward the coast. The raft follows behind them. Everyone reaches land. Then the ropes became tight. A low wooden platform loaded with nearly 150 people has enormous resistance in the water. The boats struggled. The people in the boats feared losing control. The raft dragged behind like a wet building. After only a few miles, the tow ended. Exactly how it ended has been argued over for 2 centuries. One version says the tow lines were deliberately cut or released. Another says the boat carrying the governor was the first to stop towing, and the other boats followed. A more forgiving version says the entire arrangement was physically unmanageable, that ropes broke or had to be released because the boats themselves were being endangered. The surviving witnesses, Savigny and Corréard, had their version. Other participants had theirs. Even today, the clean answer people want does not exist. The result does. The boats moved away. The raft did not. 147 people were now floating in the Atlantic without meaningful control over their direction. The first night killed roughly 20. There was no railing around the raft. Waves rolled through it. The timbers moved against each other. A person could lose balance, catch a leg between heavy pieces of wood, be knocked down by another body, or simply disappear into black water. In darkness, rescue becomes almost impossible. You can hear someone shouting 3 feet away and still fail to reach them. The center of the raft became the most valuable real estate in the Atlantic. There, the water might reach only the knees. Along the edges, it could rise to the waist or chest. That difference sounds modest until you imagine standing in cold, moving seawater for an entire night. Then the difference between knee-deep water and chest-deep water becomes the difference between exhaustion and collapse. People pushed toward the center. People fought to stay there. By morning, the raft had fewer passengers and more fear. The second night was worse. Some soldiers reached the wine. Alcohol entered bodies already exhausted, dehydrated, frightened, and sleep-deprived. Coordination became worse. Judgment became worse. Suspicion became easier. Fighting broke out. The dispute quickly became more than a drunken scuffle. Men fought over the central part of the raft, over supplies, and over control. Sabers and improvised weapons appeared. Groups formed and attacked each other in the dark. By morning, dozens were dead. Some later accounts put the number lost during the violence as high as 65. Nobody on that raft had the luxury of taking attendance with a clipboard. The survivors were trying not to become part of the count. During the chaos, barrels of fresh water were lost. That changed everything. A person can survive a surprisingly long time without food. Water is different. Under direct sun, surrounded by salt water, wounded, exhausted, and drinking alcohol, the body dehydrates rapidly. The cruelest thing about being thirsty at sea is the quantity of water around you. It is everywhere. You cannot use it. Seawater contains so much salt that drinking it forces the body to spend more water removing the salt. The ocean offers an unlimited supply of something that looks exactly like what you need, and makes the problem worse. The only woman on the raft was thrown into the sea during the fighting. Someone pulled her back. That small episode says something uncomfortable about what was happening. Human behavior did not simply become evil. It became unstable. The same group capable of throwing a person overboard could also risk losing someone else while dragging that person back. Civilization was not switched off like a light. It flickered. By the fourth day, roughly 67 people remained alive. The biscuits were gone. The fresh water was gone, or nearly gone. Wine remained, but wine cannot replace water. The living were hungry, wounded, burned by the sun, and surrounded by bodies. Then came the part of the story that made the Medusa famous. The survivors began eating the dead. Savigny and Corréard later described it plainly. Flesh was cut from the bodies. Some pieces were dried in the sun. A small fire was made using bits of wood and gunpowder, and attempts were made to cook what could be cooked. For respectable European society, this was horrifying. It was also very easy for respectable European society to be horrified while sitting in a dry room after dinner. On the raft, morality was now competing directly with metabolism. The survivors tried other things first and continued trying them even after cannibalism began. They chewed leather from belts and military equipment. They tried pieces of clothing. They chewed parts of their hats and cartridge boxes. Almost anything that had once come from an animal suddenly looked more like food than clothing. The early survivor narrative contains details that are almost more disturbing because they are so small. They found a lemon. One lemon. It nearly caused another fight. Imagine the scale of thirst required to turn a single lemon into treasure. Later, they found around 30 cloves of garlic. Under ordinary circumstances, that is something sitting forgotten near the back of a kitchen. On the raft, it became a resource. They also found small bottles containing liquid used for cleaning teeth. Drops of it gave temporary relief to mouths that had almost stopped producing saliva. Some of the men drank their own urine. Even that became organized. The liquid was collected in small metal cups and allowed to cool before being swallowed. The survivor account says the cups could be stolen with the liquid still inside. There are moments when history becomes impossible to understand as a statistic. A stolen cup of cooled urine is one of them. The legs of the survivors were deteriorating. Salt water soaked the skin continuously. Wounds remained wet. Skin softened, peeled, and became raw. There was no dry deck where someone could stretch out for a day and recover. Then sharks began circling. At first, they were another shape in the water. Later, they came close enough to the raft that survivors struck at them with sabers. The sharks moved away. Then they came back. This happened while men were already chewing leather and drying human flesh in the sun. At some point, the word disaster stops feeling adequate. 2 soldiers were accused of secretly getting into the remaining wine supply. On land, stealing wine is a disciplinary problem. On the raft, wine was one of the last liquids separating the group from complete dehydration. The men were judged dangerous to everyone else. They were thrown overboard. There was no prison, no guardhouse, no place to isolate someone. The Atlantic became the punishment, because the Atlantic was the only place available. By about the 8th day, the survivor account gives 27 people still alive. Only 15 were considered capable of surviving much longer. The others were badly wounded, sick, or close to death. Now the people who remained faced a calculation that is probably the darkest part of the entire story. The sick continued receiving a share of the wine. The supply was shrinking. If the strongest 15 continued dividing what remained with men who seemed certain to die, perhaps nobody would survive. So they decided who would keep drinking. 12 badly wounded or dying people were thrown into the sea. Later retellings often round the number upward and describe around 15 people being sacrificed. The early survivor narrative gives a colder arithmetic. 27 remained. 15 were judged capable of continuing. 12 were removed. This was not a nighttime riot. It was not a drunken fight. It was a decision. That is what makes it harder to dismiss. When a terrified man strikes another person during a brawl, we can tell ourselves that panic took over. Here, the survivors believed they were thinking rationally. Their logic was simple. There was not enough for everyone. Some were going to die. The supplies should go to those with a chance. People who had lived in cities, served in armies, studied medicine, read books, attended church, and understood perfectly well what murder meant, had arrived at a different system of arithmetic after 1 week on a raft. Savigny and Corréard later wrote about this instead of hiding it. That choice matters. They were not presenting themselves as spotless heroes. They were admitting that they had survived partly because other people did not. By the 10th day, the group was tiny. The raft that once held nearly 150 people now carried only a fraction of that number. There was more physical space, yet the survivors had almost no strength left to use it. The sharks were still there. The sun was still there. The salt was still there. There was no direction. There was only waiting. On the 13th day, July 17th, a sail appeared. It belonged to the Argus, a brig that had originally sailed from Rochefort as part of the same French expedition. The survivors tried to make themselves visible. Men stood where they could. Cloth was waved. Bodies that had spent almost 2 weeks collapsing into the raft suddenly had one more reason to move. This moment later became the center of one of the most famous paintings in the world. But even the history of that moment is not perfectly clean. Modern institutions still describe the mission of the Argus differently. One account describes the discovery of the raft as essentially accidental. The Louvre presents the Argus as having been sent to search for it. That disagreement is useful because it prevents the story from becoming too neat. History rarely arrives neatly packaged. The men on the raft did not care why the Argus was there. They only cared whether it could see them. According to an influential interpretation of the event later used to explain the painting, the survivors first saw the distant vessel and signaled, only to watch it continue away. Imagine that. 13 days. Almost everyone dead. A ship finally appears. You wave. It disappears. Then, roughly 2 hours later, the Argus came back. The raft had been seen. 15 people were taken aboard. For them, that was the end of the ocean. It was not the end of dying. A body that has spent nearly 2 weeks without enough water, without real food, with open wounds and constant exposure, does not become healthy because someone carries it onto a deck. Several of the 15 died soon after rescue. Among them was Jean-Charles, a black survivor who played an important role during the final attempt to attract the Argus. Roughly 10 members of the original raft group survived in the longer term. That is normally where the story of the Medusa is told to stop. A shipwreck, a raft, cannibalism. 15 rescued. The end.
Hold it tight.
Except that the most uncomfortable part of the story was still sitting 30 miles away. The Medusa had not sunk. After the evacuation, 17 people had refused to leave the frigate. Think about how those people must have looked to everyone climbing into the boats. The ship was stranded. Waves were hitting it. Officers feared the hull could break apart. Hundreds were evacuating. 17 men essentially said no. They stayed. At the time, this could easily have looked suicidal. Then, 1 day passed. The Medusa remained. Another day passed. Still there. A week passed. Still there. A month passed. Still there. 54 days after the evacuation, people returned to the bank of Arguin. The frigate was still standing on the sand. Of the 17 people who had remained aboard, 3 were found alive. Now run the arithmetic again. Nearly 150 people were placed on the raft because staying with the stranded frigate seemed too dangerous. Within 13 days, only 15 remained alive on the raft. Meanwhile, the abandoned ship itself survived for nearly 2 months. That does not mean keeping all 400 people aboard would definitely have saved everyone. That would be an easy conclusion, and a dishonest one. A stranded wooden frigate could have broken apart. Weather could have changed. The hull could have flooded. Supplies could have failed. Disease could have spread. The people making decisions in early July did not know the Medusa would still be there in late August. They were choosing between risks. They simply chose the risk that turned out to be worse. This is why the Medusa is more disturbing than a normal shipwreck. In a normal shipwreck, the ship disappears and the sea becomes the enemy. Here, the ship remained. The rescue became the enemy. The Medusa itself still contained things that the raft desperately lacked: shelter from direct sun, solid deck space, tools, remaining stores, barrels, timber, places where a person could sit or lie without standing in salt water. The raft had almost none of that. Yet the raft had been called Salvation. The ship had been called the Danger. History can be cruel enough to reverse the labels after everyone has already made the choice. There was another reason people eventually returned to the frigate. Valuables remained aboard. Accounts of the recovery mention government property, money, and gold connected with the colonial administration. Later retellings often compress this into one bitter sentence: they went back for the gold. The exact mission of the Argus and the sequence of searches are described differently in different accounts, so it is better not to pretend the story is cleaner than it is. What is clear is that valuables on the Medusa mattered enough for recovery efforts to continue. That gives the story an almost obscene symmetry. Human beings on the raft could disappear into the Atlantic. Government property on the frigate still had an address. The people in the lifeboats had their own ordeal. Most eventually reached the African coast, but reaching land did not instantly mean reaching safety. Some groups had to move through a harsh coastal desert with limited water. Heat and exhaustion continued the disaster on land. Encounters with local nomadic groups added another layer of uncertainty and fear. Governor Schmaltz and Captain Chomeret eventually reached St. Louis. Their experience was not comfortable. It was also nothing like the raft. Some survivors later received help from British officers in arranging their return to Europe. The French administration did not cover itself in glory during the aftermath. Then the survivors began talking. The ship surgeon, Henri Savigny, prepared a report. Savigny had been on the raft. He had seen the fighting. He had seen the bodies. He had participated in the decisions. His report did not remain safely inside naval bureaucracy. It reached an opposition newspaper and appeared in September of 1816. Now the disaster changed form again. It was no longer only something that happened at sea. It became politics. The restored Bourbon government had placed a royalist captain back in command after roughly 2 decades away from serious sea service. That captain had lost a major frigate during what should have been a routine colonial voyage. Nearly 150 people had then been left on a raft. For government opponents, the story was almost too perfect. They did not need to invent symbolism. The administration had built it for them. Savigny later joined Alexandre Corréard in publishing a detailed book about the disaster. It went through repeated editions and translations. Europe read the names. Europe read about the wine. Europe read about the killings. Europe read about the dead being eaten. The scandal grew because this was not a faceless story about weather. There was no hurricane to blame, no enemy cannon, No mysterious sea monster. There were decisions. The captain had taken the ship too close to dangerous shallows. Warnings had been ignored or mishandled. The convoy had been left behind. The ship had grounded. The evacuation had failed. The raft had been abandoned. Every stage had a human fingerprint on it. Chaumaret was eventually tried by a naval court at Rochefort. He avoided the death penalty. He received a prison sentence of 3 years. The legal case could punish a captain. It could not put the story back into the ocean. By then, the Medusa had become something larger than a maritime accident. To many French readers, it looked like a miniature version of society itself. The well-connected had seats in boats. Soldiers and ordinary passengers ended up on the raft. Authority made mistakes. The weakest paid first. Whether every political interpretation was fair hardly mattered anymore. The symbol worked. Then a 27-year-old painter found the story. His name was Théodore Géricault. Géricault could have treated the Medusa like any dramatic historical subject. Read the newspaper, imagine the scene, paint desperate people, collect applause. He did something much stranger. He investigated it. He met Savigny and Corréard personally. He questioned them about the raft. He wanted its dimensions. He wanted the arrangement of bodies. He wanted to understand where the barrels had been placed and how the platform behaved on waves. He had a model of the raft constructed. He put the model in water. He watched it move. Géricault was not trying to paint a generic disaster. He was reconstructing one. Then he began studying corpses. He visited hospital morgues and obtained human remains to keep in his studio. Arms, legs, a severed head. Accounts of his preparation describe him keeping one head for days so he could study how death and decomposition changed flesh. There is dedication to realism. Then there is storing a human head while working on a painting. Géricault crossed that line without much hesitation. He spent more than a year preparing. The final canvas was enormous, roughly 16 feet high and more than 23 feet wide. That matters because the raft of the Medusa is not a picture designed to sit politely over a fireplace. It is a wall. A person standing in front of it is physically smaller than the disaster. Géricault had several obvious scenes available. He could have painted the night fighting. He could have painted men thrown into the sea. He could have painted cannibalism. He actually made preparatory work involving the cannibalism. Then he rejected that moment for the final composition. He chose hope, or something that looks like hope. At the bottom of the painting are bodies and men too weak to move. Above them, survivors begin turning toward the horizon. Higher still, people rise and wave. At the top, a black figure lifts a piece of cloth toward the distant ship. For this figure, Géricault used a black model known as Joseph. He was not simply painting a literal portrait of Jean-Charles. Géricault was constructing a visual climax from the real events and from models available in his studio. That distinction matters. The painting is based on the catastrophe. It is not a photograph of it. At the far horizon is the Argus, tiny, almost nothing. One of the largest paintings of its era makes the object everyone wants to see almost absurdly small. That is the trick. The closer the survivors are to us, the farther rescue feels from them. Géricault showed the work at the Paris Salon in 1819. It was not initially presented under the blunt title the world uses today. It appeared as Scene of a Shipwreck. Nobody needed much help guessing which shipwreck. The scandal was only 3 years old. The government was still dealing with the political smell. The survivors were alive. The captain had been tried. Paris knew exactly what it was looking at. The painting received a gold medal, but the reaction was divided. Some critics admired the ambition and composition. Others attacked the ugliness of the subject and the physical realism. This was not a noble, ancient battle with clean, heroic death. These were recent French bodies rotting on a badly managed French raft. A year later, the painting was shown in England. The response was much warmer. Around 40,000 people reportedly came to see it in London. That number tells you something about media before cinema. Today, a catastrophe travels through video within minutes. In 1820, a gigantic painting could become mass entertainment, political commentary, news memory, and spectacle all at once. People paid to stand in front of the nightmare. Géricault did not live long enough to enjoy a comfortable old age as the famous painter of the Medusa. He died at 32. Only after his death did the French state acquire the canvas that now hangs in the Louvre. Time then did something Géricault probably did not intend. Some of the materials in the paint darkened. The scene became even more somber. Millions of modern visitors now see a painting that looks darker than it did when Paris first saw it. The disaster aged into its own shadow. Most viewers naturally look toward the upper right part of the canvas. The living men are there, the cloth is there, the distant ship is there. Everything points forward. That is how hope works in the painting. Once you know the full history, another direction becomes harder to ignore. Backward. Somewhere beyond the invisible horizon behind the raft stood the Medusa, the ship they had escaped, the ship everyone expected to die, the ship that refused to disappear. That is what turns the story from horror into something more unsettling. Cannibalism is horrifying, but the mechanism is understandable. Starve people badly enough, remove water, sleep, order, shelter, and hope, and eventually the human animal begins making choices that polite society prefers not to imagine. The greater puzzle is how they got there. The Medusa was not destroyed by a storm. It was not hit by another ship. It was not attacked in battle. It sailed onto sand. Then people tried to save themselves. That rescue plan created a situation far deadlier than the original grounding. There was no single decision where everyone clearly chose madness. That would almost be comforting. Instead, there was a chain of decisions, each of which had its own explanation. The governor wanted to arrive quickly. Reasonable. The captain trusted the wrong advice. Bad, but human. The ship went closer to shore, faster route. The guns stayed aboard. They were valuable military equipment. The hull seemed threatened. Evacuation began. The boats did not have enough room. Build a raft. The raft was too heavy to tow. Release it. Every link can be explained. Put them together, and men are fighting sharks with sabers while drinking cooled urine from stolen metal cups. That is why the Medusa still feels modern. Large disasters are often imagined as giant mistakes. More often, they are small mistakes that cooperate. One person wants speed, another wants status, another refuses to look foolish. Another follows the first boat. Another assumes someone else understands the plan. Nobody wakes up intending to produce catastrophe. By evening, catastrophe has a schedule. The people on the Medusa were not fools because they feared the ship would break apart. The people who stayed were not prophets because they guessed correctly. They were human beings, making decisions without the ending. We have the ending. That gives us a dangerous advantage. It allows us to laugh at the man who thought clouds were land. It allows us to condemn the captain who refused to dump guns. It allows us to say, everyone should have stayed on the frigate. None of them could see 54 days ahead. They could only see the next wave. And that is what makes the arithmetic of the Medusa so cold. Nearly 150 people went onto the raft because it was supposed to move them toward safety. 13 days later, 15 were alive when rescue arrived. Several of those 15 still died. 17 people refused to leave the stranded frigate. 54 days later, 3 of them were found alive on the ship everyone had considered doomed. The Medusa disaster does not prove that staying is always safer than leaving. It proves something less comfortable. Sometimes the thing that looks like rescue is only another danger with better advertising. Géricault painted men stretching toward a sail on the horizon. For 2 centuries, people have stood in front of them and looked in the same direction. Maybe the strangest part of the story has always been behind them. The ship did not sink. The rescue did.